It's September 26th, 1960. Two men step in front of television cameras for the first televised debate in American presidential history. This debate will kick off one of the most tumultuous decades in all of American history. A time of intense political violence, deepening Cold War tensions, fierce social upheaval, and a growing generational divide that would forever change the nation. Yet, on that September evening, all of that still lay ahead. Two very different candidates stood ready to face the nation for the very first time on live television. Both men delivered sharp arguments that night, often agreeing on the need for America to move forward. Yet for the more than 70 million Americans watching on their television screens, something new and powerful was at play. Not just a debate in policies, but a moment that would test leadership under pressure, communication in a new media age, and the ability to connect with a rapidly changing electorate. In one of the closest elections in U.S. history, the stakes extended far beyond a single night, reflecting broader anxieties about the Cold War, economic competition with the Soviet Union, and the future direction for the United States of America. On one side, John F. Kennedy, representing a new generation of leadership and calling for bold action to meet the challenges of a changing world. On the other side was Richard Nixon, the experienced vice president, offering continuity, stability, and a steady hand in very uncertain times. To understand how this election took shape, we need to take a closer look at each candidate, beginning with Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts, the Democratic candidate. Young, handsome, charismatic. Kennedy was promising a new way forward, a new frontier. He claimed he was not satisfied with the status quo under the Eisenhower administration and called for effective governmental action. Kennedy refrained from personally criticizing President Eisenhower, who had been in office for 8 years and had remained widely popular, about as popular as a president can remain after 8 long, strenuous years in office. Instead, Kennedy spoke carefully about shortcomings in the administration, without actually naming the president. Kennedy was mindful not to alienate voters by directly attacking Dwight Eisenhower, a widely respected figure and former Supreme Allied commander during World War II. At the same time, Kennedy emphasized the need to move the country forward, calling for renewed energy, new programs, and stronger leadership to address domestic challenges and match Soviet progress in areas such as economic growth and national strength. Kennedy, however, had serious challenges facing him in this election. As a Catholic, Kennedy faced much skepticism from some voters who questioned if a Catholic president would be more loyal to the Pope in Rome than to his own country. Just a few weeks before the first debate, Kennedy spoke to a group of Protestant ministers where he dropped a famous quote, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic." Kennedy's address was viewed as a success, but his faith was still a topic of conversation, and it was going to play a role in this election no matter what. In addition to his religion, JFK's age would be a hurdle that he would have to overcome in this race. Kennedy was just 43 years old when he ran for president in the 1960 election, making him one of the youngest major party nominees in U.S. history at the time. In an era where voters often associated presidential gravitas with age and experience, his youth stood in sharp contrast to the 3 previous presidents. Dwight D. Eisenhower was 62 when he took office in 1953 and 70 when he departed in 1961, while Harry Truman had assumed the presidency at age 60 and left office at age 68. Even the president before Truman, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had been elected to his first term at age 51 and went on to be elected to 4 terms. Though he did not live to complete his final term, he served into his 60s. If Kennedy were to win this election, he would become the youngest president ever to be elected, and the second youngest president ever to serve, with Theodore Roosevelt being the youngest to serve after he assumed office after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. To address the age narrative, Kennedy cleverly flipped the criticism into a central strength of his campaign. Rather than defensively trying to appear older or more seasoned, he embraced his youth and reframed it as a powerful asset for a new era. He repeatedly invoked the idea of a new generation of leadership, arguing that the United States needed fresh energy and imagination to confront the challenges of the Cold War, the space race, and a changing world, contrasting this with what he portrayed as the tired, complacent leadership of the Eisenhower years. Kennedy also had something else going for him. He was a war hero. Kennedy frequently highlighted his World War II service on the campaign trail. He often spoke about his command of PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat that was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands in 1943. Despite a severe back injury, Kennedy showed remarkable courage by helping his crew swim to safety, and then spending hours towing an injured sailor through shark-infested waters using a life jacket strap clenched to his teeth. He later received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal of Heroism along with a Purple Heart. In the end, Kennedy turned the age issue on its head, converting doubts about his youth into a compelling message of vigor and hope. Kennedy was also facing a daunting electoral map. The electoral map was shaped by 8 years of Republican dominance. Dwight D. Eisenhower had cruised to 2 landslide elections in 1952 and 56, leaving the GOP riding high in popularity and positioning Vice President Nixon as the clear favorite to succeed him. With the Republicans holding the White House and much of the country seemingly comfortable with the status quo, Kennedy needed a way to crack the map, especially in the South, where Democratic loyalties were strong, but doubts about a Catholic candidate ran deep. To meet his challenge head-on, he turned to Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas as his running mate. The choice was a calculated, strategic masterstroke. Texas and its 24 electoral votes would be a borderline must-win for the Democrats' chances in 1960. Pairing the young Catholic Northeasterner with a Protestant Southerner who commanded respect across the region would balance the ticket geographically, religiously, and generationally, while giving Kennedy a fighting chance to hold the South and its crucial electoral votes. Lyndon B. Johnson brought extensive Washington experience to the ticket, having served 12 years in the House of Representatives and another 12 years in the Senate, where he had risen to become one of the most powerful and effective majority leaders in congressional history. Having addressed questions about his youth and his faith, and reinforcing his campaign with LBJ as his running mate, Kennedy entered the race on firm political grounds. On the other side, Richard Nixon from California, the Republican candidate, vice president under Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years. Professional, intelligent, ambitious. Nixon was promising continuity, experience, and steady progress rather than radical change. He presented his time as vice president as a period of peace, prosperity, progress, and reasonable leadership that he had successfully moved America forward without the problems of the previous Truman administration. He defended the record vigorously while arguing that the U.S. was already moving forward and did not need the drastic changes that Kennedy was proposing. Nixon, like Kennedy, served in World War II and pointed to it throughout his campaign. Nixon spoke about his time in the Navy to frame his experience as part of a lifetime of public service, often recalling his time stationed in the Pacific Theater, where he helped manage logistics and supplies for the servicemen. He spoke of long hours overseeing shipments and ensuring sailors on remote bases had received the equipment and provisions that they needed. Nixon could present himself as someone who understood responsibility and practice. He used these stories to connect his personal experiences to a broader sense of duty and national service. However, it was never going to be easy for Richard Nixon. No matter how popular an administration is, it is rarely easy for the same party to win a third consecutive term after 8 years in the White House. Voters often grow restless and crave change, and 1960 proved no exception. Nixon, like Kennedy, faced significant challenges. Nixon entered the 1960 election with a resume built on experience and continuity. However, the same association became a limitation. Rather than being seen as an independent leader, Nixon was often viewed as an extension of the Eisenhower administration, not necessarily a new direction for the country. In a political climate increasingly shaped by Cold War urgency and change, many voters were starting to look for something different, something more forward-looking than the past 8 years had brought them. This challenge was further amplified by moments that cast doubt on Nixon's individual contributions within the Eisenhower administration. When asked to name a major decision that Nixon had contributed to, Eisenhower famously said this:
"If you give me a week, I think of one, I don't remember, because..."
While this often gets portrayed as an election-changing moment with years of hindsight, it most likely did not swing the election as much as we like to think. However, it did give voters much doubt about Nixon's accomplishments within the administration, and did not help defeat that narrative. And in an election that was expected to come down to razor-thin margins, any mistake such as this could prove very costly. While Nixon worked to emphasize his experience and foreign policy credentials, the perception that he had stood in Eisenhower's shadows persisted. Some of these challenges Nixon created on his own. Early in his presidential campaign, Richard Nixon pledged to campaign in all 50 states. It is worth noting that this is the first election to feature all 50 states in the country. Just 1 year before, in 1959, were the additions of admitted states Alaska and Hawaii. Nixon wanted to project his strength and stamina. He wanted to portray himself as somebody that could outwork his opponent and handle the demands that came with being president. Nixon emphasized national unity. With 2 new states in this election, visiting all 50 states reinforced the idea of a full, united, modern United States. While this was a noble and objectively cool campaign strategy, it proved to be a massive blunder. Campaigning all throughout the United States spread Nixon's time and energy way too thin during a tight and demanding race. Instead of focusing on key battleground states like Texas, Illinois, or Missouri, Nixon was devoted to states that he was either certain to win or unlikely to flip. This grueling travel schedule also contributed to visible fatigue, as Nixon appeared physically worn down. He struggled to maintain his usual energy and even lost noticeable weight. To be fair, much of Nixon's physical decline was not solely to the result of travel, but also due to a knee injury sustained on the campaign trail in Greensboro, North Carolina. After striking his knee on a car door, the injury caused a serious staph infection, forcing Nixon to pause his campaign and undergo treatment. The injury left him hospitalized for 2 weeks, and then by the time he returned to the trail, he appeared noticeably weakened. In the end, the Republican candidate did fulfill his pledge to visit all 50 states with a visit to Alaska on the eve of Election Day. For many Americans, this accomplishment did reinforce Nixon's image of endurance, determination, and work ethic. Nixon just had to wait and see if it would pay off at the polls. While the national polls painted a tightly contested race, the underlying electoral map told a way different story. It is important to note that during this time in American history, unlike modern times, many states were not as entrenched into consistently voting the same way across multiple election cycles. In any case, the map certainly leaned in favor of Nixon initially. Nixon inherited a Republican coalition that proved to be politically successful throughout the 1950s, particularly across the Midwest and much of the West. Nixon's strategy to strengthen this already favorable map was to select Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate. Lodge was a seasoned public servant whose resume included service as a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and more recently a U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, where he represented American interest on the global stage during the height of the Cold War. Lodge's foreign policy credentials and appeal to moderate voters were meant to reinforce Republican strength in key regions and even contest Democratic ground in the Northeast. Together, this presidential ticket appeared well positioned and had a clear path to 269 electoral votes. Yet elections are not decided on paper. To the millions of Americans watching the first 1960 presidential debate on television, John F. Kennedy came across as the clear winner. He looked tanned, rested, youthful, and confident, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that stood out against the background, smiling easily and gazing directly into the camera with calm poise. In contrast, Richard Nixon appeared pale, sweaty, and uneasy, fatigued from a rigorous campaign schedule, still recovering from a recent illness and that knee infection. He had lost weight and wore a light gray suit that blended into the studio set. Interestingly enough, many people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon came across as the winner. On the radio, Nixon's performance was judged more on substance. His responses were detailed, and he came across as well-versed on the issues. For radio audiences, the debate sounded like a contest of knowledge and command. And in that area, many people thought that Nixon exceeded Kennedy. Contrary to popular belief, this debate alone did not decide this election at all. While the first debate became the most famous, 3 additional debates followed, each giving the candidates opportunities to articulate their positions on major issues. One observation stands out from this debate. For viewers today, especially those frustrated with the tone and substance of modern politicians on both sides of the aisle, I implore you to watch this first debate between Nixon and Kennedy. This debate slaps. What stands out in this debate is not theatrics or personal attacks, but a serious discussion of very complex issues in a time of so much uncertainty. Both men spoke with a mutual respect of each other, something that feels so rare these days. It can serve as a reminder that not only presidential debates, but any type of debate, can be done with humility of the other person. But to fully understand the weight of this debate, we need to investigate the world that these candidates were speaking to. In 1960, Americans were voting in a time of anxiety. The United States was locked in a tense geopolitical battle with their rival and its ideology, the Soviet Union and communism. The Cold War was an intense struggle for global power, influence, and progression. The geopolitical conflict touched mostly every issue in this election. Just a few years earlier in 1957, the Soviets launched the first artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. Something that just 50 years prior, most people would have not believed was realistically possible. But by 1960, it wasn't just possible, it had become a reality and a symbol of power. The Soviets' successful space program raised questions on whether the United States was falling behind, not just technologically, but militarily. In response, Eisenhower established NASA in 1958. And just like that, the space race was underway. For American voters, though, the question became quite clear in 1960. Which candidate can ensure that the United States would not just catch up, but lead in this new era of competition? For Vice President Nixon, the answer was found in steady leadership. During his time as VP, Nixon was perceived as proactive in foreign policy. Eisenhower sent Nixon all over the world, building alliances and being a diplomat to various countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Just 1 year before the election in 1959, the United States and the USSR engaged in what was known as the Kitchen Debate. A spontaneous exchange between the two countries at an American exhibit in Moscow. Nixon initiated and drove this exchange against Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Standing in a model American kitchen, Nixon defended the strength of US capitalism against Soviet communism. Nixon did not shy away from the moment. He matched Khrushchev point for point, defending the strength of American consumer prosperity. American reactions to the kitchen debate were sharply divided. The New York Times was largely dismissive. They described the exchange as little more than a political stunt that highlighted the deep ideological gulf between East and West, but did almost nothing to advance the actual issue at hand. The paper also noted that American public opinion appeared split in the aftermath of the debate. In contrast, Time magazine was far more impressed with Nixon's performance. They praised him for successfully embodying the spirit of the American character, proud of its peaceful achievements, deeply confident in its way of life, and resolute in the face of the Soviet threat. No matter how anybody felt about these exchanges, one thing is for certain. This initiative helped build Nixon a reputation as a reliable representative of the United States in foreign affairs, and he knew it. Nixon positioned himself as the candidate who understood the stakes of the Cold War. He held a firm stance against the Soviet Union and communism. In doing so, he largely followed the approach of Eisenhower, emphasizing the policy of containment, an effort to prevent the further spread of communism rather than directly rolling it back. With it, he supported the continued investment in defense and space technology. The Republican candidate leaned on Eisenhower's record, highlighting the creation of NASA and Explorer 1, which was America's first satellite. He also argued that the United States had superior long-range bombing and nuclear capability over the Soviet Union. Nixon claimed that if elected, he would continue the peace and prosperity that Eisenhower had brought the nation in the 1950s. For many voters, this message offered reassurance. In a race defined by Cold War uncertainty, his emphasis on containment appealed to those who valued stability and were wary of abrupt change. His approach suggested that the United States was on the right path and that steady leadership was the best way to confront the Soviet threat. But Nixon was not the only candidate defining America's path in the Cold War. Kennedy presented a different approach, arguing that the United States was falling behind and needed bold, decisive action to meet the Soviet challenge. For Kennedy, the central issue of the Cold War was not simply maintaining America's position, but confronting the growing perception that the United States was falling behind. He challenged the idea that the nation could rely on past successes, warning instead of a missile gap between the United States and Soviet Union. Where Nixon pointed to strength and stability, Kennedy emphasized vulnerability and the need for action. He argued that the Soviets' recent advances in space and in missile technology were not just symbolic victories, but an indication of the shifting balance of power. In this view, complacency posed a greater threat than confrontation. He called for increased investment in defense and science, framing the Cold War as a test for national will as much as military strength. At the same time, Kennedy did not advocate for reckless confrontation with the Soviets, but from a position of strength that would allow for serious negotiation. He believed that only by restoring America by credibility, militarily, and technologically could the United States engage the Soviets from a position of confidence rather than caution. Kennedy tied economic policy directly to the Cold War, arguing that a stagnant economy undermined America's ability to compete with the Soviets. His campaign emphasized stimulating economy growth through investment, innovation, and modernization. Kennedy wanted to increase federal spending on education. He would point to the Soviets and warn that the US was losing ground because the Soviets were investing far more heavily in education. Kennedy acknowledged all the good that NASA had done in the early part of the space race, but supported increased spending for the administration to pass the Soviets in the race to space. This message resonated with voters who believed that the United States needed to do more than simply contain communism. It needed to outpace it. In the eyes of voters, Kennedy offered a vision of change, arguing that only bold leadership could secure America's new place in this evolving global struggle. Kennedy, like Nixon, had a relentless campaign schedule. Kennedy, however, had a much more strategic approach to his campaign stops. A lot of his time was focused on key battleground states, particularly large industrial states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. The Democrat also targeted key swing states such as Illinois, New Jersey, Missouri, Minnesota, Texas, and California. Kennedy and his team zeroed in on the most populous and winnable battleground states. This was a very disciplined approach to the campaign trail. The Democrats were not going to spread themselves thin. JFK's appearances became events in of themselves, drawing large, enthusiastic crowds who were excited to hear him speak. His focused message of change along with a concentrated campaign trail could prove to be a difference in an election that could very well come down to one or two states. Civil rights emerged as a defining moral and political issue during the 1960 campaign. Even if it was not always at the forefront of every speech, both candidates understood its growing importance, particularly as television brought scenes of segregation and protest into American living rooms. Yet Kennedy and Nixon approached the issue with different tones and political calculations, each trying to balance national leadership with the realities of a divided electorate. Nixon entered the race with a tangible record on civil rights, having supported the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 as vice president. These acts were early efforts to protect black voting rights, mainly in the South. They expanded the federal government's role by creating new institutions and allowing greater oversight of voter registration practices. Nixon framed civil rights as a matter of law and order and steady progress, taking a "we will do as much as we can without completely rocking the boat" point of view on the issue. Nixon believed that meaningful change would come through the courts and federal enforcement, not dramatic campaign rhetoric. Kennedy, by contrast, initially moved carefully on civil rights, cautious of not alienating Southern Democrats whose support he needed to win. However, as the campaign progressed, he began to adopt a more visible and morally changed tone, framing civil rights as not just a legal issue, but a test of American ideals. His campaign increasingly highlighted the realities of segregation, tying civil rights to his broader message that the United States could not lead the free world while denying basic rights at home. While not on the forefront of issues to the extent that the Cold War was, the issue of civil rights was about to get a spark in this election. In October of 1960, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta during a sit-in protest against segregated lunch counters. But the situation escalated when he was later sentenced to 4 months in prison for a probation violation tied to a minor traffic offense. Nixon urged President Eisenhower's administration to pressure Georgia officials, or at least explore ways to secure King's release on bond, viewing it as a way to demonstrate Republican commitment to civil rights. A strongly worded draft statement condemning the arrest and supporting King was even prepared for Eisenhower to issue. Eisenhower flatly refused to get involved. He saw King's case as a purely local judicial matter. Eisenhower generally preferred to let the courts and states handle such disputes rather than pressure from the White House. At the same time, Kennedy moved swiftly. He made a direct gesture by calling Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife, while his brother Robert Kennedy worked behind the scenes to help secure King's release. Kennedy's campaign followed up by making direct phone calls to Georgia officials. In the end, a $2,000 appeal bond was set, and King was released after 8 days in custody and flew back to Atlanta. Martin Luther King Jr. himself later acknowledged that the Kennedy family, including RFK's direct contact with officials, served as a great force and did a great deal to make my release possible. This helped galvanize black voters to show up and vote for Kennedy. As Election Day approached, the significance of these moments loomed large. When the votes were finally counted, the election of 1960 proved just how much every little decision made during this campaign mattered. The election of 1960 unfolded as one of the closest and most dramatic contests in American history, with John F. Kennedy narrowly defeating Richard Nixon in both the popular vote and electoral college. On November 8th, Kennedy won approximately 49.7% of the popular vote, while Nixon captured 49.5%, a margin of just around 112,000 votes nationwide. Less than 0.2%. In the Electoral College, Kennedy secured 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219, with 15 going to unpledged electors in Mississippi and Alabama. Despite what looks like a comfortable electoral margin, the reality was far tighter beneath the surface. Several key states ultimately decided the election, and many of them were razor thin. Illinois, one of the most critical battlegrounds, was won by Kennedy by roughly 8,800 votes out of nearly 4.8 million cast, a margin of about 0.2%. Texas, another crucial prize with its large electoral vote count, was decided by about 46,000 votes, roughly 2%, aided in part by LBJ's presence on the ticket. New Jersey was even closer, with Kennedy winning by just over 22,000 votes, about 0.8%. Missouri came down to fewer than 10,000 votes, around 0.5%, while states like California, Nixon's home state, went the other direction, but still reflected how competitive this race was nationally, with Nixon winning there by about 0.5%. These narrow margins highlight just how evenly divided the country was in 1960. Because of how close these states were, the simplest path for Nixon to have won becomes clear when looking at the Electoral College math. If Nixon had flipped just Illinois' 27 electoral votes and Texas's 24 electoral votes, both highly competitive states, he would have gained 51 additional electoral votes. That alone would have shifted the final count from 303 to 219 in Kennedy's favor to 270 to 252 in Nixon's favor, giving Nixon the presidency. Even more simply, flipping Illinois and Missouri together would have brought Nixon extremely close, requiring only one additional small state to potentially change the outcome. This illustrates that the election hinged not on a broad national shift, but on a handful of tightly contested states where a relatively small number of votes could have changed history. In the end, the 1960 election was not decided by a single debate, a single moment, or even a single issue. America stood at a crossroads, with voters divided on whether the country needed steady experience or bold change to meet an uncertain future. And in a race decided by razor-thin margins, it was often the smallest moments, the image on a television screen, a phone call in a moment of crisis, or a campaign stop in a key state that made the biggest difference. And with the benefit of hindsight, the election of 1960 carries an even deeper weight. John F. Kennedy's presidency would be cut tragically short in 1963 when he was famously assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Richard Nixon, who came so close in 1960, would later become president, only for his career to collapse in the wake of the Watergate scandal. In the end, what began as a contest about the future of the nation became in many ways a reflection of how unpredictable the future truly was.